Germans did not send just a few second-line troops to watch over these islands. Afraid that the British would move to recapture them, great numbers of German soldiers arrived soon, to the point that eventually there were approximately one soldier for every 2 islanders. That translates to about 30,000 to 35,000 soldiers in an area not much larger than Green Hills and Belmead combined. 30 to 35,000 soldiers. Because of the perceived threat in the German mind that the British would indeed try to retake the islands, the Germans decided to fortify them heavily, and to that end set about erecting massive concrete and steel fortifications, many of which remain there today. We saw some of them. Huge prison camps were built to house the literally thousands of prisoners from all the nations with which Germany was at war. This construction program would make the islands a mighty fortress, an extension of the Atlantic Wall. Over 200 strong points were built with walls several feet thick. Thousands of mines were placed not only on the islands themselves, including the beaches, but also on the water surrounding the islands. All of this required tremendous labor, consisting mainly of Russian and Eastern Europeans, but also French, Norwegian, Danish, Dutch, Belgians, and those from other nations which had fallen to Germany. Much of the building work became the responsibility of the organization TODT, T-O-D-T, a state construction agency that was virtually independent of the military. Dr. Fritsch taught the founder was a strong Nazi in support of Hitler. He had built the Autobahn road system. Although he was accidentally killed in a plane crash in 1942, his system for construction remained in place, and practically all of the construction on the Channel Islands was done using his harsh methods, mainly with prison labor. A few of these prisoners escaped from the Nazis and tried to hide out on the islands. One Russian prisoner escapee was sheltered in an attic for a year or so by the great-grandfather of a young man from Jersey who I happen to know. He was my grandson. If he had been caught, both the escapee and the man who took him in would, in all likelihood, have been executed. Not only did the TODT organization build the fortifications, it also supervised the construction of barracks, mostly underground, to house thousands of German soldiers. However, due to lack of any radio or newspaper reports, the islanders never received any public information as to what was going on, or what they knew and learned was what they saw and heard by way of mouth in that particular area of the islands. In every respect, the German government took over the islands from top to bottom, virtually isolating the islanders from Britain and the rest of the world. The Channel Islands became part of Germany's famed West Wall and were called by the Germans Festung Jersey and Festung Guernsey, Fortress Jersey and Fortress Guernsey. Propaganda played a major and important part in the Channel Islands occupation. Before the Germans arrived, the islanders had been bombarded with stories of uncruelty. The Germans, anticipating this, initially put on a show of extreme politeness and consideration, with many of their officers speaking perfect English. This did not last long, however, as the politeness quickly faded away and the harsh rules imposed by the invaders encroached more and more on the freedoms which had so long been a major part of the islanders' lifestyle. After the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940, after it saved Britain from invasion, German propaganda took a different turn, focusing on the great success the Nazis were having against Russia, rather than Hitler's failure to cross the Channel. Fabricating such gems as Churchill banquets while millions starve, King George VI of the Jews, and American troops mortified England. News from Britain and its allies was practically non-existent. Radios were confiscated, and what little mail allowed in was heavily censored by the German authorities. A very few radios were successfully hidden from the Germans, and this allowed a very few islanders to pick up bits of BBC broadcasts from time to time, but the punishment for being caught with a radio was severe and thus a strong deterring force. Common practice was to build a homemade wireless radio to listen to BBC. The punishment was severe for anyone caught. Messages were sent to the islands by Red Cross after Central. One clever message arrived from the headmaster of a school who had evacuated to England. It read, quote, "Tommy, Joe, and Sam's boys working very hard, doing very good work, should graduate with honors near future," unquote. People who knew the headmaster and who had their children under his care knew none of these names, but finally it came to them that Tommy was the British soldier, Joe was Russia's Stalin, and Sam was Uncle Sam. Who stayed on the island suffered extreme deprivation. The Nazis were intent on imposing their way of life. For instance, the private use of cars was banned, and the best vehicles were requisitioned by the Germans, with the islanders being reduced to bicycles and coffee. Village German soldiers were an intriguing spectacle, often tall, handsome, and blonde. They were happy to be staying on a sun-drenched island far from the Russian front. In the beginning, the individual soldier was on his good behavior. This led to some collaboration, particularly by some young girls who became romantically involved with soldiers, even to the point that a number of babies were born to them. This was to have a devastating consequence, as I'll discuss later. Before that, look at official Britain's position toward the islands. Churchill could not understand why there was not extreme resistance to the islands toward the invaders. He apparently forgot that the islands had been demilitarized and thought that Jersey and Guernsey should rise up and fight the Germans. At first, the war cabinet agreed, to the point of sanctioning a commando raid to assist the islanders in their uprising. Small landing parties reached Guernsey on a few reconnaissance benches, but were unsuccessful. The raiders were captured and narrowly escaped being executed as spies, which in reality they were, and the idea of a full-scale commando raid was shelved. Some referred to this failed mission as Churchill's fiasco. At one point, the RAF made a raid on supply barges coming from nearby France, but this prompted a reprisal by the Germans in the form of a cut in the islanders' food ration. Also, from time to time over the next few years, small incursions were made for the purpose of intelligence gathering, but no more serious thought was given to a major invasion of the islands by the British. Apparently to this day, the question goes on as to whether the islanders were victims or collaborators. It is a difficult question to answer. One British scholar said it is extremely painful. Another said that the majority of the Channel Islanders collaborated with the occupiers, while the islanders have never admitted their guilt. They see themselves as victims who had no choice but to work with the Germans in order to survive. Others chose passive resistance, primarily by trying to escape to liberated France. Those who were not evacuated in mid-1940 were for the next almost 5 years, in effect, prisoners of war in their own country, and were treated as such. After D-Day, June 6, 1944, in fear of more sizable commando raids, the Germans adopted a more strict approach to controlling the islands. The beaches were mined and put out of bounds to the civilians, and the islands were used as a place to treat wounded German soldiers injured in France. In September of 1942, an abrupt order came down that all men not born on the islands and between 16 and 70 years of age, together with their families, would be deported to Germany. The deportees were sent to various labor camps in Germany, where many were treated very badly, like those, in concentration camps. Excuse me. A number of Jews were deported from Jersey to concentration camps and death camps on the continent. To try to ameliorate the suffering of those still on the islands, island officials often acted or tried to act as buffers between islanders and the German occupiers. But this was difficult and often proved to be a two-edged sword in that the officials, if caught, or being suspected of siding too much with the civilians, were punished very severely. Several were deported to prisons in Germany. One writer, in discussing collaboration, put it this way: at no time did leading islanders accept German authority other than by enforcement. The islands were surrendered without a fight on orders from London. While mistakes were made, most of them, starting with ill-conceived, poorly managed evacuation,